Prepare to be dazzled by our first speaker in this session. Karen Kasmauski has photographed more than 24 major stories for National Geographic magazine. Please join me in welcoming Karen.
Hi. I am a photojournalist and I am a story developer with a very keen interest in global health, which is what I've been asked to talk about today. I'd like to share some of my observations that I've learned on this journey, and yes, with some of those previous speakers said I am one of the 51% of people who do believe my life is a journey. And so I hope to give you a quick trip through the issues of global health as I have come to know them. And also, as a storyteller, one of the things that I really like to do is try to make eye contact with these, or make pictures that can create an eye contact for these very difficult issues. Try to put a human face on these themes. Well, people often ask me why or how can you actually do these kind of stories that are oftentimes sad and trying. So I'm going to answer that question with a story that will explain why I continue to do global health issues over these years. I was given an assignment a few years back by National Geographic on viruses. At first I thought this was a science story, but I found that it was one that was very full of human drama. It took me to one of the first shoots that I did for them. It took me to Mirador, Brazil, where I was covering a yellow fever epidemic. There was a lot of people that had died, and they had sent in a team of vaccinators, and I was allowed to come in with this team of vaccinators. At a local clinic, I saw this young boy. He was lying on a mattress. He was quite ill. He was very yellow. And I asked the doctor who I was with what was going on, and it found out that his brother had died the week before of yellow fever. His father, when he saw this child as ill as he was, he brought him down on his back off the mountain to this clinic to try to get some help. This boy was seriously dehydrated. He needed an IV bag. These IV bags only cost about 50 cents each, but the father had absolutely no money. Unfortunately, in a lot of the world, including our own, if you don't have money, you're not going to get the care that you need. So they were just letting this child rest until he could go back up on the mountain. So I'm a photographer, so I started to photograph the scene, and suddenly there was this big flurry of conversation, and then next thing I know, this IV bag comes out with its pole. Just all kinds of stuff started happening, and they began to treat the boy. So I looked over at the doctor who was escorting me, and he kind of shrugged, and he said, he goes, I told them it was probably better that you photographed them helping the boy rather than letting him die. So the next day we returned and we found the boy sitting up, and he was doing well. He was tired and he was about to go home. So as we left this clinic, this doctor, who was actually an expert in yellow fever, turned to me. He said, he said, yesterday I don't think I would have believed that this boy would have walked out of this clinic alive. So this sort of simple intervention, an IV bag given to this boy because a photographer was present, made a big impact not only on the boy but also on me. And I saw the power of bearing witness, and this chance encounter is what exactly started me on this course of doing global health stories whenever I can, so that maybe other people who see these stories will also bear witness. Well, this is a child. I got to travel a lot of different areas doing these kinds of stories, and this is a child in Bangladesh that was born underweight into extreme poverty. But you can see his grandmother's holding him. It's really important to me to show that we have a lot of things in common. And family is one of the things that we have in common. There are almost over 7 billion of us on this planet, and the numbers keep getting larger. And every day about 250, quarter of a million of us are born every single day. And it is us, we are the ones who are responsible for these little people. And a health educator said we need to become responsible ancestors. And I really love that term because it has a real longevity to it, responsible ancestors. When I did the virus story, it really started making me think about a lot of root causes, like what exactly is the state of global health in the world? What is the symptoms of changes? I tried to sort of connect the dots to weave together the many threads that I was beginning to call the ecology of disease. And I could see that some of these threads were things like civil war, rural to urban population shifts, changes in sexual and social behavior, oppression of women and girls, and also the creation of rapid global transport. And all of these contribute to a rise in diseases and into devastating health trends. Other contributions I notice is that we overuse our resources and we often abuse the land when we do so. This happens to be my footstep, in fact. It is on a shoreline. It's some oil that has risen up on a shoreline of an island that was contaminated from the Exxon Valdez spill. I don't know if you even remember that spill. It was a terrible spill about 20 years ago. Well, I took this picture just 10 years ago, and the oil was still very present. Our footstep on this planet is quite large, and the richer we are, the larger it is. A child in the United States consumes about 10 times more the resources than a child in Africa. So oftentimes when I hear about people complaining about those 8 kids in Africa born to some poor old mom, I think, well, maybe we ought to be looking in our own backyard first before we start complaining about other people. Climate change is a really big deal when we talk about people's health. Global warming can often extend the range of diseases. I worked with this health worker in Mali, and he's actually in the middle of a dried up lake bed, and he's lifting up the slab to see if there's any moisture left. There had been multiple seasons of drought here, and unfortunately there wasn't any moisture at all. When I travel to these arid countries, I can see how communities such as this one that live on the very edge, barely surviving, can really be heavily affected by global weather pattern changes. Population pressures move people right up to political borders. As you can see here, this is California. It's bumping right up against Mexico. Mexico is the densely populated area. California is the farm area. And diseases often cross political lines with this continual migration of people around the planet. Health issues that we have often thought were actually somewhere in this, developing country somewhere, where they're hitting us right now in the face. I mean, who would have thought that West Nile would become part of our natural landscape? And I think at one point we thought we were rid of TB, and now it's returning back also. Travel has really made our planet much smaller. And when I used to be a National Geographic photographer, there wasn't a single location on this planet that I went that a tourist hasn't been there before me. It is a very small world. Well, half of the humanity now lives in cities, megacities, about 10 million or more. And these are often taxed to their limits. Infrastructure is if it exists at all, it's very weak. As a photographer, I find these areas I find them fascinating. I love the idea of continual motion of people coming and going, and the idea that every individual in these places has their own personal story. But I think that survival in this kind of motion can be a bit draining. Because I know for me, working in this is very draining, even though I love seeing it. Access to clean water for me is going to be the next big dividing line between those who have and have not. Walking on the slum, this is a slum in Bangladesh. That previous picture was from Dhaka, Bangladesh. Walking through the slum on a very hot morning, it was like walking through an open sewer. The slum has very few pumps for relatively fresh water, and there are probably tens of thousands of people who live in this slum. Toilets, even these little ones that you see up there, little measly toilets, even these simple ones, oftentimes they're not even available for everyone to use. People will use these ponds for both washing and toilet behavior. In Bangladesh, also in Dhaka, at a cholera hospital, I came across this very wonderful program. When the children get better from cholera, and the moms seem motivated, they ask these moms to come into this, I call it a nutritional boot camp, But what they do is they teach these moms how to feed their children healthy foods based on local food, food that they can just find in their local marketplace. The two children on the left-hand side are malnourished. They have just entered the program. These are all 2-year-old toddlers. They're all the same age. And they're probably in their second and third day of this 21-day program. And the toddler on the right has just completed the program. So after just 21 days of food, he's a healthy child. Food is really so basic, and it is really the best medicine that we can give children to fight diseases. As a photographer, one of the challenges is illustrating things that don't seem to be illustratable. So things that are very complicated, not obviously visual, such as disease vectors. I mean, how do you photograph a disease vector? So I was working on a piece about how diseases move from animals to humans, and I went to Asia and came across this very large duck farm right in the middle of a crowded city. And at the time, I don't think they have these farms anymore, but at the time it wasn't unusual for ducks like this to live in close proximity to humans that consume them. It's basically raising your animals close to the marketplace. Animals are the vectors for a lot of newly emerging diseases. They are passed on to humans, usually in the slaughter process, when we, make them into our food. An example of that is things like influenza and this new mutated H1N1 virus. Those are both things that came out of the the animal pool. And how global health is expressed is really determined on where you live. In developing countries, people tend to struggle with diseases and health concerns that are consequences of poverty. They also struggle with things like infectious and parasitic diseases. Most of the population in developing countries tend to be young. And children that are born in poverty are expected to work at an early age in order to help support their families. This child was in India. I actually just spotted him when I was working with some polio vaccinators. And he was not the exception, he was actually the case. There were a lot of children in this area working in these kind of conditions. And in the developed world, we have our own issues. We have issues that are connected to wealth and consumption. Here, our populations tend to struggle with chronic issues like obesity and lack of fitness and heart disease and cancer and stress, issues that are associated with stress. This is actually on a beach in San Diego. And also in the developed world, we are an older population. We are as old as the developing world is young. And with this aging population comes a lot of health concerns, things like Alzheimer's disease. This happens to be an Alzheimer's daycare center, and it was really quite poignant because this woman kept wanting to know where her daughter was, thought she had been forgotten by her daughter. It was quite sad. And this woman, the nurse, was actually comforting her, telling her, don't worry, she's coming. As we get older, we have more need for caregivers, and our nation, as an older nation, will start to have more need for caregivers. In both worlds, it is these health caregivers, these health providers, that this human contact that we all need, that I feel like is really the secret weapon in the struggle for good health. Because whether you live in the developed world or the developing world, the key to good health care is whether or not there's enough workers to deliver it. These people they bear witness to global health stories, and they are actually our frontline troops. They're very important. I visit the slums of Nairobi to photograph this woman, Philomena. She's a volunteer nurse, and she works with AIDS patients who really desperately need the care. Like this is a pregnant woman who is being examined by her. And in many places, like this slum, these health workers do face quite a risk. Their jobs are in these very unstable communities with very limited resources, and yet they still go out there and try to make their communities better. They're quite amazing individuals. A month after this picture was taken, violence did break out in this slum, and she was no longer able to reach her patients. She had to stop her services, though I can say fortunately she was not hurt at all. And if you don't have health workers, you can't deliver simple things like vaccines. I mean, vaccines are a very small action that has a major impact on the lives of especially children. And in rural communities, these workers, like this nurse, so this is in eastern Kentucky, They are oftentimes the only contact that many isolated people have to the outside world. When I followed this lady, Sarah, I was pretty impressed because she really didn't hand out any medicines. Really, the best medicine that she had was listening. I mean, I felt like she just cured people just by listening to them. Listening can really be a very powerful healing tool. And I think good caregivers know how to do that. And they also know how to help and advise people at risk, like these heroin addicts. Oftentimes, they are the only people who can move about in these stress communities kind of safely. I went into the slum, actually it was exactly 3 months after my child was born. I went into the slum. It was quite an interesting story. Don't have time to tell it. But anyway, I went into the slum with an outreach worker in Puerto Rico. And he was very concerned about my safety, and he told me to keep my cameras in my bag, because this was a very high-risk community in terms of crime. And he said, keep your cameras in your bag until we get into this particular room, which happens to be a shooting gallery for heroin addicts. And his comment was, you look like a nurse, and they don't bother nurses. So these people sometimes are protected by their profession. And they also console those who are experiencing great loss. We like to oftentimes throw drugs and technology at health disasters, but it's really that human concern that increases the effectiveness of these tools. In this area that has been devastated by AIDS, this is Uganda, the village volunteers that are these women that just volunteer to go help people who have suffered, are helping this grandmother. She's an African grandmother, a Ugandan grandmother who has she has just buried the last of her 9 adult children, all of whom had died of AIDS. AIDS is one of these incredibly perfect diseases. It is a perfect storm disease. It is a disease that takes advantage of all the social upheavals that affect us, the host, humans. It is passed along by the same way in which we reproduce. It stays with us and long enough and keeps us healthy enough so we can infect others without even knowing that we ourselves are infected. And it also mutates frequently, so it makes this a very difficult vaccine very difficult disease in which to create a vaccine for. And children are often hard hit by this disease. They lose both parents. Sometimes they get infected themselves. This is in India. I followed a group of health workers who are working in the brothels of India. This was in Mumbai for a story that I was doing on AIDS. And a large portion of the sex workers at that time were infected. I think it was like almost 75% of this community. I had met many of the women. Almost all of them had been forced into this life by horrible circumstances. I've never, ever heard a prostitute say, I've always wanted to be a prostitute. I mean, you know, they're just forced into this by terrible circumstances. And I saw this beautiful child, and she was among many beautiful children that I saw in this community. So knowing this system here, I wondered, why would you bring a child into this world? Knowing, inevitably, that they would become like their mothers. And so I asked these women, I said, why do you bring children into this world? Why do you have children? And their response was, because it is the only normal thing that we can do. For solutions to work, they also have to fit into the lives of people who use them. They have to be culturally appropriate. Guinea worm was a parasite is a parasite that is quite horrible. I went with some people who were working with this particular disease, and a simple filter can keep the parasite out of the family's drinking water. This happens to be in Mali. But with nomadic populations, it's often hard to keep a filter intact. These are fine mesh filters, and sometimes these people, not knowing better, will hang them up on thorn bushes to dry and things like that. So somebody had to figure out that if you want nomadic people to use a guinea worm filter, you had to make it easy to carry and easy to use. And so they came up with this idea of a straw filter that you just hang around your neck. It's a simple solution that's just wonderful. I always like to, when I tell these stories of global health, I always like to tell stories of hope also, because hope is, I think that's the only way we can actually respond to things, is if we feel like there is some hope at the end of the tunnel. In much of the world, women do bear the burden of finding basic things in life, like food and water and even fuel to cook the food. And that means that girls have no time to study or go to school or learn a skill. And everyone is in agreement with the World Health Organization that the quickest way to eliminate poverty is to educate your girls. So if you don't educate the girls, you don't eliminate poverty. And the other thing that everyone is in agreement with, and it ties it all together, that poverty is the underlying reason for most of the global health issues. So we have to always think about these different threads that are coming together because, you know, one sort of affects the other. This is a picture from a program that is run by Brock, which is a wonderful nonprofit in Bangladesh, and I hope one day they win the Nobel Prize because they certainly deserve it. They've set up library clubs for young teens, girls between the ages of 11 and 15, because in rural areas, because this is a danger age for these girls, and oftentimes they're forced into marriage at that age. So if they can be learning and have their parents see them learning, you know, maybe they can avoid that action of being married off young. When I work in the field, I often try to stay open to serendipity, but sometimes your best stories come from that. A chance encounter can have an interesting story behind it. Like this one here, I happened to see this woman and asked her what she was doing. She was walking amongst all these beautiful hanging weavings. And I found out that she was given a loan from the Grameen Bank to help maintain her family's weaving business. And this loan, it was a very small loan, not only gave her own family jobs, but provided jobs for other people in her community. So economically empowering women can also help fight poverty and to also keep families healthy. Achieving a world where everybody has a chance for a healthy life is built on a whole lot of things. This is actually a student nurse in Bangladesh. As a photographer, what I can do is really just help people make that important eye contact that I had mentioned earlier. And that contact, that connection, I hope, that they make with all these complicated issues will encourage others to hopefully bear witness to these things and will hopefully continue the conversation of change. So thank you very much.